One thing that is there on your sheet that I didn't mention what they do because it's not really on there, but if you look where it says GAO, okay? GAO is another support agency of Congress. They are basically like the budget auditors. So Congress allocates money October 1st. Let's pretend that they do it right and they get all the money allocated. So that money now goes to the executive branch, and it's now the president and the bureaucracy's jobs to start carrying those bills out, because that's basically law. They said you're going to spend X amount of money on this, so they do that. Well, GAO will check up on them, and they'll say, so how are things going? You know, are you spending the money correctly? Oh, have we had some kind of disaster? Do you not have enough money? Do we need to take money from one place to another? I always remember I had this professor in college who was my statistics professor. He was retired. He used to work for NASA. And he had like the coolest job. And he used to talk about how much he loved working for NASA. But the reason he eventually left, he said it was so frustrating because he was a researcher, maybe doing some kind of project, but because they were part of the federal government and they were really non-essential, they would lose their funding all the time. So they're working on a project, and then suddenly there's some kind of disaster. Congress, through the GAO, can take money from one agency and give it to somebody else. So just because you've been allocated that money doesn't mean you always get to keep it. There might be times and situations where Congress might take that money away. I'm not saying that they do that with regularity, but I would think especially agencies that aren't so essential or that aren't so political. You know, if you think about NASA, I mean, that's not like a political entity, it's NASA. And so they're a very easy group to kind of take money away from. So that can happen as well. So GAO and CBO are part of Congress. OMB is part of the executive branch. All unelected people who are basically performing some kind of bureaucratic or administrative function to help the bureaucracy and the president or to help legislators perform their budgetary roles. Okay? All right. Real quick, we need to look at this picture because I messed up and I forgot to include it in my animation. Who's that? Right, President Nixon. And I always tell my students that as we get through the course that most of the time, if federalism isn't the answer, then Nixon is. President Nixon was like just the aftermath and like the investigations that went on with the Nixon administration. One of the things that we found is that President Nixon exercised this power. He did something called impoundment. Think about like if you impound a car, right? So if you impound a car, what do? Like the police, what do? They take it away, right? And they do with it what they're going to do, okay? So when the president impounds funds, that means that Congress has allocated X amount of money to, say, buy a boat, and the president says, I'm not doing that, and so he directs the bureaucracy to spend the money a different way. President Nixon did that. Previous presidents also did that. He's not the only one. But because we had such an imperial presidency with him, and we had such pervasive abuse of power, and we had such cynicism about government, that's where it was a big turning point. So that process that I showed you guys, where we looked right here, this process was created as a result of Nixon's behavior. And this process was created by something called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1964. So this is not in the Constitution. You're not going to open up Article 1 or Article 2 and see, well, by April 15th, Congress, blah, blah, blah. Like, this was all created by Congress. So if Congress created this process, what does that tell you then can happen with this process? Say it louder, you're right. It can absolutely be changed. It can be changed, manipulated, dates can be changed, dates can be whatever, because these are rules. This is not framers' intention. Framers' intention was that Congress held the purse strings and that the House of Representatives would originate the power of taxation. The Senate would have to confirm that. The President would have to approve. But this is colossal politics in America, right? And there is a constant jockeying back and forth between the President and the Congress. But I will say that since the 70s, Congress has greatly asserted their control. They have greatly asserted their role in this process, because basically they're doing all the stuff, and then it comes to the president, and he has the option to either sign it or veto it, and we'll talk about the consequences of those in just a minute, okay? All right, so let's move on. All right, so I got a little cartoon for you. So we got a vocab word. The word is omnibus. So let's try to break this cartoon down a little bit. What do you see? Okay, looks like a Trojan horse. And what do y'all remember? Like, what is a Trojan horse? What were they doing? Right, they were hiding stuff, right? They were trying to like sneak stuff in. So this is actually a British cartoon, but it doesn't matter because it still works. So an omnibus bill, I told you that there's about 13 appropriations bills. Think about all the things our federal government spends money on. 13 budgets? That's not a lot, right? Because our bills are what are described as omnibus. An omnibus just means really big with lots of detail. So if you pretend, and let's say that you had like a transportation bill. And so that transportation bill, you go through line by line and it says, okay, we're going to allocate X amount of money for construction. We're going to allocate X amount of money for renovation. X amount for this. X amount, like they're going to go through. But it's a huge, huge, huge bill, okay? What tends to happen then is something that looks a lot like that. So let's see if we can break this down a little bit. So it says omnibus budget and says the riders were hung on the stocking with care in hopes that nobody would notice them there. What do you see? A lot of different details. Good. And if the cartoon is saying we hope that nobody would notice them, what do you think those details are then? Like, what do you think that is? Secrets, maybe. Okay. It's something that we're trying to sneak into the budget. So remember I told you earlier that the Affordable Care Act was passed as a result of the reconciliation process? This budget process is so big, and there's so many things in there, and you're spending months and months and months working on this piece of legislation, then sometimes you end up compromising. Okay? So let's say that Sydney and I are on this committee together, and we're writing the transportation bill. And she is a congressman from this area, and I represent South Texas. Okay, so I'm like from South Texas somewhere. And so we're like, you know what? We've been here for years. We've been here forever working on this bill. And she says, I think that the people of District 3, we're so much growth, we really need to make sure that their roads are better developed. So this is a transportation bill. So through the markup process, I think I'm going to go add, I don't know, like $100,000 in there to renovate the roads in North Texas. I'm like, that's a really good idea. We've got some growth in South Texas too. I'm going to add X amount of money to develop tollways. And I have a brother who is owns a construction company, so let's go ahead and just allocate that money to him. Okay, that's going pretty far, but it does happen, right? Those are basically what those riders are. Does anybody know what we refer to that as? Where we're getting money that's going to be spent for local community, like for our home communities? You read about it. Bringing home the bacon. Let's watch this video clip and see if y'all can get it.
It's not just that delectable meat used for one of America's favorite foods. In Washington, pork refers to earmarks. That's when members of Congress from both sides of the aisle skirt the regular budget process to use tax dollars for absurd local projects that only benefit themselves or special interests. You've probably heard of them. The Teapot Museum in South Carolina, the indoor rainforest in Iowa, research on goth culture and aquatic plant control. But what you may not know is that since 1991, Congress has approved 110,442 earmarks, costing taxpayers $323 billion. In the 2016 Congressional Pig Book, Citizens Against Government Waste found 123 earmarks worth $5 billion, a 21% increase in cost from 2015. Earmarks have not been around forever. America's founders did give Congress the power of the purse, but as James Madison wisely proclaimed, federal dollars should be spent on great national works only, since if it were unlimited, it would be liable to abuse and might be productive of evil. In 1995, earmarks reached epidemic proportions and became a widespread form of political currency to help congressmen get reelected and grease the skids for large spending bills. The process became toxic that members of Congress went to jail for corruption in connection with the practice. Earmark abuse peaked in 2006, costing taxpayers $29 billion. In 2011, Congress was forced to enact an earmark moratorium. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Within a year, CAGW not only found earmarks, but also discovered that the earmarking process had gone underground. Now, pork projects are funded behind closed doors. Members simply beseech the appropriate federal agency to fund their earmarks, and they leave no public fingerprints. If Congress doesn't adopt a permanent ban on earmarks, billions more of your tax dollars will be wasted in this corruptive system. For more information, visit cagw.org. Also find us on Facebook.
Okay. All right. Obviously that is from a watchdog group that has very strong feelings about pork and earmarks, right? And it's pretty extreme. They're not incorrect though. Okay, so somebody tell me what is pork barrel or earmarks? Y'all are killing me. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
When congressmen will take tax dollars and use it for their own problems or their own things that they want to solve or do or research.
Awesome. Okay. How does omnibus spending contribute to the process of pork barrel and earmarking? Let's go back and look at this. Yes, ma'am.
It allows us to get overlooked easily.
Good. And here's the deal. There are members of Congress who hate this process. Think it's wrong. They're like, we want a small federal government. We don't want to be spending federal dollars that were collected by the entire country only in certain communities. That's usually the problem people have with it, is it just doesn't seem fairly balanced. So if we're, Sydney and I were engaging in this earmark stuff, and it was William, right? Okay. And William's on our committee, and he's made a campaign promise that he's not going to do that. And he's a diehard conservative, and he's like, I am absolutely not do that. I'm all about small government. But we've been there for months. We've been working on this bill forever. Well, if he digs in his heels and like, I'm not doing it, then we don't move forward. So the reality is people end up compromising and agreeing to do something that philosophically they might be opposed to for the sake of the greater good, for getting a budget, for making it to October 1st, and that money's been allocated. I will also tell you that many congressmen and senators will say that they are opposed to it and then will absolutely engage in the practice. Like our previous senator, the one that was there before Ted Cruz, when she campaigned, she talked about how bad it was and she would never do it. And then sure enough, there are countless examples of pork in Texas that were secured by her, to benefit people. Okay, pork is another great example of constituency service because you're doing things for your community. Like, do you really care? Like, have you noticed that our roads are getting more crowded in Frisco? Like I'm definitely feeling it, right? So if Sam Johnson does something that gives us money to alleviate that, most people aren't going, ooh, that's federal money. I didn't want that to be spent here. Like, we don't think about it in terms like that because, the federalism debate isn't part of your regular life. So philosophically, we might not like it, but in terms of practicality, it's not something that drives what people vote. I will also say it is still a very small portion of the budget. So it amounts to a small percentage of the money that we spend. But it's still money that we spend, and we overspend. So you could look at it. So you can look at it from both perspectives. Okay, it's not a huge issue, but it can be. And there's all kinds of silly stories, like the ones they were showing you about the Goth research. If you Google pork and you look up some examples, there's some hilarious ones. Like there was a university that wanted to do research on shrimp, like how how fast they moved or something. Like there's a picture of this little shrimp running like moving on this little treadmill or something, and or maybe it was a lobster. I don't remember. There's the most famous was this. It was called the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska, where the senator